Hello, I'm Dr. James Yun. I'm a clinical immunologist and allergist, and I work in both private and public hospitals in Sydney, which means I see patients with allergy and immune system problems. And I also have done some research in drug allergy in Switzerland, and I also have an appointment as a senior lecturer at the University of Sydney and Western Sydney University. More importantly though, I'm a Christian and I'm a follower of Jesus Christ. So, bit of disclaimer before I start, I am not representing Sydney University, Western Sydney University or New South Wales Health in my talk here. I have had a number of conversations with Christian friends who are concerned about vaccines in general. And I found that there are lots of ideas in social media which I think could be quite distracting and misleading. So rather than say, as an expert, you need to listen to me, rather, I'm here as a fellow Christian who happen to know a little bit of science and medicine to really humbly share with you what I think is fact and truth so that you can make up your mind. I think it's an important topic, so I'll start with pray for wisdom and open heart. Dear God, we just come humbly before you and we just pray that you will give us wisdom and open hearts so that we may know the truth and we may make right decisions. I just pray that whatever I share here will become easier to understand and clear to the listeners. In Jesus' name we pray, Amen. So, what are the objections against the vaccine? So I think we can break down into 4 different things. The vaccine itself, efficacy, does it work? What about the side effect? Is it dangerous? And then you can look at the motivations behind the vaccine, and there are a lot of ideas behind that. So for example, people say pharmaceutical industry are out to make money. There are lots of ideas about the hidden agendas of the government that they're trying to control us, take away our freedom. What about the disease itself, the COVID-19? Some people claim that the vaccine is worse than the disease. What about alternative treatment strategies? Ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, zinc, etc. And what about alternative preventative strategies like herd immunity, preventative medicine? And finally, some people are genuinely concerned about the ethics of vaccine itself, especially the origin of the vaccine. Is it using aborted fetal cells? And I have right to refuse vaccine. I have right to say no. It's my freedom. And how does that fit into all of this? So before we delve into that, I just wanted to consider the response to COVID-19. So when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, it impacted us in a number of ways profoundly. And you can see in the slide here that it's a bit of a mess. The vaccine itself is, at the end of the day, it's a medicine. But somehow it's entangled with political, economical, even spiritual components to the whole issue. And you hear all sorts of ideas, and it is very confusing. So what I'm trying to do in this slide is just take vaccine and spiritual issue out of the equation. And I just want to examine those 2 things. The vaccine itself, and how does Christianity and what we believe fit into the vaccine, so that you can help and make decisions about vaccine. Of course, it interacts with other areas, and I might briefly touch on that, but I think if you can understand the vaccine itself, I think it'll help you to delve the issues a bit better. So, how does the vaccine work? So first of all, you can see in the slide, you've got different viruses represented in a picture there. So for example, if you come in contact with measles virus, you get sick with measles, and then your immune system will kick in, and it'll generate immune response and you'll make antibodies against measles, and on top of that you have a particular immune cell called T cells which will recognize measles and kill the measles infected cells. So immune system's designed to deal with infections very effectively, and not only that, once the infection's dealt with, we then retain the memory so that if you get exposed to the same viruses again, we can fight it off very effectively. The problem with that approach is that people get sick when they're infected, and something like COVID-19 means you can get really sick and a number of people will die as a result. So the vaccine is designed to help us to build an immune response against the virus, against the bacteria and so forth, without getting sick, so that when it comes in contact with those viruses and bacteria, we'll mount adequate immune response before you get sick and deal with it. So that's essentially how vaccines work. So you want to have effective immune response, but you also want to build memory response so that after many months and years, if you come in contact with the virus, you can deal with it. But at the same time, you want to have minimal side effect. I also want to highlight that the picture I'm showing you here is simply antibody response, and some people I heard that we need a T cell response, not antibody response. And that is true. But I also want to point out that with COVID-19 vaccine, the studies actually have shown it actually generates T cell response as well. Some people are quite concerned about this mRNA technology. So just to explain that a little bit, I've got this slide here. I think we need to understand how DNA, RNA, and protein synthesis or protein production works so that you understand why RNA vaccine is not really a problem. So just to go back to a bit of basic, you can see on the slide that DNA is inside nucleus and it encodes our genetic material. It is transcribed into RNA, in particular mRNA, as you can see, which is then used by ribosome, which is another molecule which binds to it. Ribosome will go and read the mRNA and then it'll churn out the protein sequences depending on what's written on mRNA. That process is actually quite complicated, but very, very, very clever design. So how does RNA vaccine work? So what scientists have done is they found sequence of RNA that's quite critical for the virus. They took a little chunk out and then they inserted into a vaccine and they injected into humans. And when they inject it into humans, those mRNA will go into cells and it hijacks, if you like, almost the system, and then it'll produce the virus spike protein, which is important for COVID-19. The cells will then churn out this spike protein, which will then generate immune response. So T cells and antibodies will come along and recognize that, so that next time you get in contact with COVID-19, you already have an immune response against spike protein so that you're not going to get infected, and those antibodies and T cells will kill the virus before you get sick. So in that process, mRNA vaccine will not change your DNA sequence. That is not biologically possible. The vaccine mRNA is using existing cell factory, if you like, to produce the protein, but actually doesn't go back into DNA. So it can't integrate into your DNA. That's the background of the vaccines. How do we address the question, the vaccine is ineffective? So some people claim that vaccine is ineffective. And what are the arguments? The arguments are, one, the vaccine has not been around long enough to know efficacy. Secondly, some people claim it's not effective against Delta variant. As you know, in New South Wales right now, it's a major problem. Some people say vaccinated individuals are still getting infections, therefore it's not effective. And finally, they point out countries that has a high vaccine rate and say they're still going into lockdown, therefore vaccine can't be working. So how do we address the question, the vaccine has not been around long enough to know the efficacy? Well, it is true that the vaccine has only been around for less than a year. As of 7th of August 2021, there were approximately 4.36 billion doses that have been given around the world. That's a lot of vaccine doses that's been given. And approximately 1.18 billion individuals are fully vaccinated. That's 15% of the world population. And not only that, 40.3 million doses are given each day, and the number's going up, so by now, it'll be higher. And so I would say, yes, the vaccine hasn't been around long enough, but the total amount of doses that's given is phenomenal, and I would say that it actually compensates for the duration of the vaccine in helping us determine the efficacy. And the efficacy of the vaccine has also been studied extensively despite the short duration, and is continually being studied. So if you wanted to do the search yourself, type in PubMed in Google. PubMed is like a big medical library online. It's got all sorts of journal articles in there, and type in search term COVID-19. You'll find already there are 164,000 results, probably now higher, because every day there are more COVID-19 articles coming out. You type in tetanus, which has been around for decades, you only get 29,000 hit. Now that doesn't mean all the 160,000 articles are great articles, but it just goes to show how much research has been pumped out in the last year and a bit. It's phenomenal. You type in COVID-19 vaccine in the same PubMed and you'll get 9,500 results. Probably 10,000 by the time you listen to this presentation. Compare that to tetanus vaccine, which has been around and very safe for over 30 years, 17,000. My guess is in the next 6 months to a year, we're going to overtake tetanus vaccine in terms of research output. So how do we determine vaccine is effective? So vaccine efficacy is calculated in clinical trials by comparing disease rates between two groups. That is, those who receive a placebo and those who receive vaccine. So if you look at the top group, placebo group, what we do is when we try to work out whether vaccine is effective or not, we give the placebo and see if it has what the baseline infection rate is like. And then we give another group, matched group, vaccines. And then we study them and observe them and see what happens. And over time, if a vaccine is effective, you expect to see number of people who gets infection in vaccinated group would be lower. And so in this particular picture, you can see there are 10 people who are infected in placebo group, whereas there are 2 people who are infected in vaccinated group, which means it reduced the infection by 80%. So we call that, okay, 80% reduction, so therefore it's 80% efficient. That's how we come up with a number, and that's quite important concept to understand. It doesn't mean the vaccine works 80% in you. It means vaccine is 80% effective in the community in reducing the infection rate. So is the vaccine effective? I just wanted to briefly show you 2 studies. So if you look at the picture on the left, that's a Pfizer vaccine study where they recruited people and gave placebo, and then they gave Pfizer vaccine. And they watched and see what the infection rate is like. And you can see beyond 14 days to 21 days, the amount of infection in the vaccine recipient group was substantially lower. Whereas you can see the placebo group continued to get infected almost in a linear sort of fashion. So right at the end, when the study was concluded, they measured number of people who got infected versus number of people who didn't in both placebo and vaccine group. And they could easily determine that the vaccine was highly effective in reducing the infection by 95%. You can just see that on the picture. In the picture says 1,000 words. And AstraZeneca vaccine study shows similar findings. Again, you can show that blue line, which represents placebo, and the orange line, which represents AstraZeneca vaccine. There was an obvious difference in the number of people getting infected. So both vaccines are highly effective. And these are not studies doing a couple of hundred people. We're talking about studies where tens of thousands of people were recruited. Pfizer vaccine study had over 40,000 people. That's a lot of people, and you do not get errors at that sort of levels. These are highly statistically significant study findings. I guess people would ask, is the vaccine still effective against Delta variant? And fortunately, a study came out just a couple of weeks ago in New England Journal of Medicine, which is a fairly respected journal. And it actually looked at how the vaccine fares against Delta variant, and reassuringly that it found that it is still effective against Delta variant. The vaccine efficacy was slightly lower in Delta variant compared to Alpha variant, but you can see it is still quite effective. So yes, the studies do conclusively show that it is still effective. Perhaps not as good as Alpha variant, but it is still effective in Delta variant. But I actually wanted to highlight the New South Wales data, because as you know, the COVID-19 infection is spreading in New South Wales, and we're seeing increasing cases every day. You can have a look at this data yourself. It's from COVID-19 weekly surveillance in New South Wales, and the latest one I could find was on 24th of July. As of 24th of July, 1,996 individuals were infected between 24th of June and 24th of July. And significantly, only 16 individuals out of 1,996 individuals were fully vaccinated. That's less than 1%. And in the hospitalized individuals, we got 371 people who were hospitalized, but only 5 were fully vaccinated. That's again only around 1%, and nobody in ICU were fully vaccinated out of 73 individuals in ICU. Fully vaccinated population is around 15%. If there is no difference, then you expect to see infected COVID-19 populations who are fully vaccinated to be around 15%. But you don't. You see much less than that. You can't even see that on the picture there because it's so small. What does that say? It says the vaccine is effective in protecting us against even Delta variant. Some people may argue, well, vaccinated individuals are still getting infections, therefore vaccine isn't working. Well, that's expected because no vaccine is 100% effective. We're talking about 95% efficacy. We're not talking about 100% efficacy. That doesn't mean vaccine is ineffective. It just means that sometimes infections happen despite people who are vaccinated. And we call that breakthrough infections. And if you think about it, no drug is 100% effective. When you get sick with nasty infections, you go to a doctor and they give you penicillin. Most times it works, but not always. And that doesn't mean penicillin is a useless drug. It's a very good drug. It's just not 100% effective. And I also found this data quite interesting. In CDC report as of August 2nd, 2021, more than 164 million people in the US have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. That's 164 million. That's a lot of people. And they found that during the same period, there were 7,525 patients with COVID-19 vaccine who had breakthrough infections, who were hospitalized or died. Now, you might say, well, look, that proves that vaccinated individuals are still getting infections. Actually, it proves that vaccine is highly effective. That's around 4 in 100,000 vaccinated people who got hospitalized or died with COVID-19. That's a very, very small rate compared to baseline population who are not vaccinated. I don't think anybody would believe the chance of you getting COVID-19 and end up in hospital or dying if you're not vaccinated is 4 in 100,000. It's much, much higher than that. Therefore, what does it say? It means, yes, vaccine is still effective. It's just that some people still get infection despite it. That's because it's not a 100% effective drug, and that's because no drug is 100% effective. Some people would argue that the countries that have been fully vaccinated are still going into lockdown due to breakthrough infections. And that's been highlighted in Israel, for example, where they're considering lockdown. UK, they've opened up, and the cases of COVID-19 is going through the roof. And they say, well, look at that, the vaccine is not working. And that's probably because those cases are likely due to Delta variant. In this data, you can compare UK and Israel versus South Africa and Indonesia. So UK and Israel is two countries have very high vaccine rate, whereas South Africa and Indonesia has low vaccine rate. And you can see that all 4 countries, the daily confirmed COVID-19 cases are going up recently, have been going up recently, as you can see there. But rather than say, well, the vaccine is not working, if you look at the death rate, you start to see huge differences. So yes, the infection rate is going up in UK and Israel, but if you look at the second graph, you can see the death rate is not going up very much at all. Whereas in Indonesia and South Africa, the death rate is going up, almost paralleling with the infection rate. So what does that mean? I think it means, yes, people can still get infected because there is a breakthrough infection, and Delta variant is a nasty variant, but it still is preventing people from getting really, really sick. I think this is a fairly convincing data that shows the vaccine actually makes a big difference. It reduces death rate. And you have to also remember, vaccine is one of many factors that affects infection rates. So social distancing, masks, public health policies, socioeconomics, cultures, all those things fit into the infection rate. Just in case someone is saying, well, I'm comparing apple and orange because UK and Israel have a really good health system, South Africa and Indonesia doesn't, and therefore that's why death rate is different. I would actually like you to point the same graph, take a few months back, have a look where the 2 peaks were before. And you can see UK had a pretty high death rate along with high infection rate. Same country, before the vaccination, they had increase in death rate paralleling with increase in COVID-19 cases. All of a sudden, after vaccination, death rate remains flat, infection rate is going up. What does that mean? I think vaccine is preventing people from getting really, really sick. So what's a Christian response to all of this? I want you to ask yourself one simple question. That's, could vaccine be answer to prayers? I remember about a year ago when the pandemic started and we were in lockdown and we were doing church services at home. But I remember distinctly our pastors were praying for the vaccine to be developed quickly. And I have to say I was a skeptic. I thought, I don't know any vaccine that can be developed in such a short amount of time. 6 months later, a vaccine came along. I would remain skeptical. I thought, that's a bit too good to be true. Then I looked at the data. I thought, okay, I'll wait for a bit more long-term data. And then I see the number of vaccines that's given around the world, and I became more and more convinced, actually, this may be the answer to prayers. Is the effective vaccine at this time too good to be true? Perhaps it is. But you have to remember, I think there are millions of people around the world who pray for vaccine, and perhaps it is an answer to prayer. As you know, in Matthew 7:7, Jesus said, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and the door will be open to you. Perhaps vaccine may actually be an answer to prayers. What about the side effects? Some people say the vaccine is too dangerous and has too many side effects. And they quote AstraZeneca vaccine and say it causes blood clots. The Pfizer vaccine causes inflammation of the heart. The vaccines cause severe allergic reactions. The vaccines cause other serious side effects such as paralysis. The vaccine will cause infertility. And we have no long-term safety data of the vaccine. Therefore, it's too dangerous. Why are we doing human experiments? That's the argument. Well, let's look at one case, which is probably the biggest one of all, which is the vaccines cause blood clots. We call that thrombosis with thrombocytopenic syndrome. I won't go into the details of it, but it is a nasty condition. But if you look at the Australian data, there are 93 cases from approximately 6.8 million vaccine doses, and 6 people die from TTS. It's unfortunate. But if you look at the actual risk, it is very small. And we're talking about order of 3 in 100,000. Now, what's the risk of you getting struck by lightning? It's about 8 per 100,000. So the chance of you getting blood clots from AstraZeneca vaccine is actually less than the chance of you getting struck by lightning. I'm going to take also a step back and compare that with other drugs. How does this risk compare to other drugs? If you go to hospital for major surgery, the chances are you're going to get a medication called heparin, which thins your blood so that you don't get blood clots after the surgery. And the chance of you getting heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, which is a condition that's similar to TTS, is about 0.2 to 2%. That's pretty high compared to 3 in 100,000. Do we stop giving heparin? No, because the benefit clearly outweighs the risk. We still do, and we deal with it. What about penicillins? I'm sure most of you had penicillin at some point in your lifetime, because it's a very good antibiotic. What's the chance of having anaphylaxis to penicillin? We're talking about 4 in 10,000 doses given. You might say that's pretty small, but you blow that out to scale, 500 to 1,000 people die each year in the US due to penicillin-induced anaphylaxis. Do you worry about dying from anaphylaxis every time you take penicillins? I don't think most people do. Why? Let me ask you another question. Imagine every time someone dies from penicillin, it gets reported on the TV, gets multiplied 100 times, and it happens every day because there are 500 people who die from penicillin a year. How do you think you respond to penicillin? The risk hasn't changed, but purely by being exposed to anaphylaxis death every time, I think you're going to start freaking out. And the chances are you'll probably be very scared to take penicillin. The risk hasn't changed, but your perception of that risk has changed. And I think that's the important point here. Yes, the TTS is real, it happens, it's very rare, but purely by the amount of exposure it got, I think it instilled enormous amount of fear in people, perhaps disproportionate to its real risk. I guess you could ask, then why does the guideline keep changing for AstraZeneca vaccine? Well, I would like to point out the potential benefit of giving COVID-19 vaccine in preventing someone ending up in hospital. So if you look at the age group between 20 to 39, you give AstraZeneca vaccine to 100,000 people, you might prevent 2.7 people ending up in hospital in ICU. Why such a low number? Because the infection rate is low, so the benefit is low as well. But on the other hand, the potential harm there is about 1.1 to 0.8 in 100,000. So you can see the benefit and the harm is about even when you have low infection rate. And at the time when the guidelines changed, there were very little infection in Australia, so they said, well, why don't we go for the safer option? And that's why they changed the guideline so that people get Pfizer vaccine. Now the equation have changed. We got we got outbreak in Sydney. All of a sudden, the potential harm is the same, but potential benefit has now changed. So because there is a high infection rate, when you vaccinate everybody in the community, now the chance of preventing ICU admission due to COVID-19 is all of a sudden higher. So if you look at 30 to 39 years, you can see that if 100,000 people vaccinated in that age group, you would prevent 8 ICU admissions. If you bring that down to 50 to 59 years, 31 ICU admissions. The risk remains still the same because the risk doesn't change, but because there are more virus in the population, now all of a sudden the benefit increases. And that's why the guidelines changed. It doesn't mean the data has changed. It just means because there are more infection, the benefit is now tipped in favor of people getting AstraZeneca vaccine. What about other vaccines? What about other side effects? Let's go and have a look at one by one briefly. What about the Pfizer vaccine that's causing inflammation of heart? We call that myocarditis. At the moment, the rate seems to be about 4 in 100,000 following the second dose of Pfizer vaccine. And you have to remember most of them were mild. There were 111 cases reported in TGA out of 5.6 million 5 doses. That's about 2 in 100,000. Probably about the same rate as AstraZeneca and blood clots. And remember, these are relatively mild conditions as well. What about the vaccines causing severe allergic reactions? Well, I happen to know a little bit about it because it's in my area. And it's estimated around 5 per 1 million doses, depending on what you read. So it could be a little higher, but if you boil down to it, it's again very, very small risk. And you have to remember, the vaccine facilities are designed to deal with this. They give people adrenaline if they have an allergic reaction, and they're trained to do that. So the risk can be managed. What about the argument that vaccines cause other serious side effects such as paralysis? For example, Guillain-Barré syndrome. It's an inflammatory condition of the nerve where you can be paralyzed. It's a nasty condition. So far, TGA has received 66 reports mentioning GBS out of 6.8 million AstraZeneca doses. That's about 1 in 100,000. And you have to keep in mind, GBS happens in 1.1 to 2 cases per 100,000 per year anyway. So the question is really due to vaccine, or they're going to get it anyway? They just happen to have vaccine at the same time. And we don't know that. The study's not conclusive on this. So you have to remember the rare side effects may happen coincidentally. So put it in context, the real or theoretical risk of vaccine needs to be balanced against the real risk of COVID-19. What about the argument that vaccine will cause infertility? That comes from the argument that antibodies against virus spike protein will cross-react with syncytin-1 and cause infertility. What does that mean? It means if you make antibodies against spike protein, then that same antibody will bind a hormone called syncytin-1, and that syncytin-1 is important in pregnancy, and because it binds to that, people will get infertile. A few studies actually looked at this and didn't find it to be true. And in fact, I've just put it up on the slide there, which you can see, and you might be able to pick out little yellow bits highlighted. That's about the similarity between syncytin and SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So bottom is a SARS-CoV-2 spike protein and top is syncytin. And if we have a program that can match the amino acid sequence and work out the overlapping areas, that's about the similarity. I don't think antibody is going to recognize 3-4 amino acid and say, well, I'm going to bind to you. I think that's highly unlikely. So I don't know where this came from, but there is no study that conclusively show that there is any cross-reactivity between the antibodies and the antibodies against spike protein and syncytin-1. In fact, the studies have shown the reverse of that there is no cross-reactivity. The final argument people say is we have no long-term safety data of the vaccine, and that's true. That's true to a degree. We haven't had it for long. But you have to remember, again, 4.3 billion doses were given. And really there is no scientific reason to be overly concerned. All those things like infertility and other concerns that people have raised haven't crystallized. And how many years would you wait before you say we have long-term safety data? 2 years, 5 years, 10 years? And what do we do in the meantime? Do we continually go on lockdown and come out, lockdown and come out for 5, 10 years? Or do you just wait until everybody's infected? Because the bottom line is the virus is not going anywhere. What's a Christian response in all of this? I think when you read about all those side effects, you get alarmed and you really worry. And I have to point out the risk is real. I'm not saying the risk is zero. It is real, but it is very low. But if you think about it, we live with risk every day. You get on the car, there is no 100% guarantee you're going to come home. How do we deal with all that anxiety that comes out of the risk? I want to point out a couple of verses from the Bible, which I think is really reassuring. And Jesus said, "Peace I leave with you, my peace I give you. I do not give to you as the world gives. Do not let your heart be troubled, and do not be afraid." And also Paul writes, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your request to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your mind in Christ Jesus." Yes, the risk is real, but it is very small. And even the small risk, we can bring it before God in prayer. What about other counter-arguments? Some people point out pharmaceutical companies and say the vaccine is a money-making scheme. And they look at the recent Pfizer profit and say, well, look how much billions of dollars they made. But I would like to point out that the ethics of pharmaceutical industry, profits, regulatory requirements, research and development are complex. And it's not just COVID-19, it extends beyond into all other areas of medicine. For example, pharmaceutical companies are making money. Does that stop you from buying any drugs? What about chemotherapy or other life-saving drugs? So if you look at the slide here, you'll see that in revenue, in vaccine, Pfizer made $14 billion in 2021 for 6 months. But that's not the only drug they've sold. What about oncology drugs? They made $6 billion out of that, oncology drugs, anti-cancer drugs. So are we going to say, well, because pharmaceutical companies making a lot of money out of cancer drugs, we're going to give chemotherapy to people who's got cancer? No, we don't do that. So why are we applying one rule to one drug and another rule to a vaccine. And I also want to highlight a very simple fact. Whether pharmaceutical industry make profit or not, it has zero influence on vaccine efficacy. If vaccine is effective, it is effective whether the manufacturers make profit or not. Let's not model up the vaccine efficacy with pharmaceutical companies' motivation and profits. What about the argument the vaccine is designed to take away our freedom? I hear that a lot, and people get really upset over this. And the vaccine passport makes some people's blood boil. People say vaccine passport will limit our freedom. What about lockdown? It's got huge impact on the family, schools, relationship, jobs, mental health, and church, and a whole host of other things. People say WHO is corrupt. But again, I want you to take a step back and examine a very simple fact. The decision regarding lockdown, vaccine passport, regulation are not a black and white decision. It is a very complex decision. If we have a black and white answer, we would have had it by now. And I'm not going to get into what's right and wrong, because if you have 10 people in the room, you'll get 10 different opinions. But I do want to highlight one simple fact, that whether there is a vaccine passport or not, whatever the policies say, at the end of the day, vaccine efficacy is vaccine efficacy, and it's not influenced by vaccine passport. In other words, if vaccine is effective, it is effective whether people introduce vaccine passport or not. Two completely different issues. Please do not muddle these things up. What's Christian response in all of this? First of all, I think we have to recognize that we live in a fallen world. Yes, the governments can be corrupt, and pharmaceutical industries have to make lots of money. Yes, we accept that. But we also have to remember we are saved by grace through Jesus. And how did God do that? God accomplished good despite evil in the world. As you all know, Jesus was crucified by people who wanted to kill him. And that's evil, but God accomplished the salvation of the humankind through the evil deed. And I'd like to point out a couple of verses in Genesis 50:20, where Joseph talks to his brothers. You intend to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Again, could vaccine be a gift from God? Whether it could be misused by government, or whether it's there to make lots of money for pharmaceutical industry, that's to a degree irrelevant, because God could use vaccine through those means still to bring good to humanity. What's our response in this? I think we should pray for the government, like what Paul said. I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. What about the argument that vaccine is worse than COVID-19? Some people say it's just another flu. I do want to remind you the Spanish flu in 1918 infected 500 million people and killed 20 to 50 million people. That's not just another flu. COVID-19 is catching up though. It has caused 202 million cases worldwide and has killed over 4 million people already. And the number's still going up. And Delta variant is not a variant to laugh at. And just to simply point out New South Wales, we've got 50% of people who are hospitalized, and they are less than 50 years old. So yes, young people still get sick and they can end up in hospital. And on top of that, Delta variant is highly infectious, much more than the original variants. And some people compare it to almost like a chickenpox infectious. And if you add those things together, it is quite a nasty infection to have. And I also want to point out a simple fact. What's the risk of COVID-19 infection versus the risk of harm from the vaccine? It again highlights what's the risk of harm in a high exposed setting or medium exposed setting, and the numbers simply point to the fact that the benefits from vaccine outweighs the risk of clots from AstraZeneca vaccine, for example. Some young people say, I'd rather take chance and get infection rather than COVID-19 vaccine. But the chance of you getting sick from COVID-19 is magnitude higher than chance of you getting sick from vaccination. And you don't have to search very deep into the statistics, because again, 50% of people hospitalized in New South Wales are less than 50 years old. And on top of that, I would also like to highlight the community risk. If everybody's vaccinated, it substantially reduces the risk of community transmission and risk of those at higher risk of getting severe infection as well. And we call that herd immunity, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So not only does it protect you, it actually protects others. So when you balance all those risks, versus benefit, the benefit clearly falls in the favor of vaccination. Time is quite critical. People say time is money. I'm going to say time is immunity. What do I mean by that? If you get vaccinated tomorrow, you're not going to be protected tomorrow. It's going to take about a month before you get some decent protection, and you need 2 doses, so it's going to take over a month, which means the vaccine takes time to work. Let's say you get AstraZeneca today, and 4 weeks later you get a second one. That's early as possible. You still have to wait a week or 2 before you get full protection. Pfizer vaccine, you get 2 doses, so 3 to 6 weeks apart. So you get one today and you get one 3 weeks later, and then you have to wait a week before you're fully protected. So that's going to be a month. What does that mean? Let's have a look at the daily confirmed cases in New South Wales. You can see where we are, the numbers going up and up and up. To get a protection now, you have to have vaccinated a month ago. That's when there were very few infections in community. So you also have to consider, if you were to get vaccine now, you get a protection from a month ago. I don't know where the number is going to be a month from now. So just consider that. Obviously, therefore, earlier the better, because you want to be fully protected as soon as you can. So what's Christian response in all of this? Well, if vaccine is safe and effective, then what is the most loving thing to do for yourself and your neighborhood? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And this is the first and the greatest commandment. And the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. So we've got to ask ourselves, what's the most loving thing to do if vaccine is effective and vaccine is safe? What about alternative medications? People talk about hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin, zinc, vitamin C, etc. and say they're magic drugs. Why are we not using that? And a number of experts claim that these medications can cure COVID-19. They also claim that pharmaceutical industry and governments are basically out to make lots of money and want people to get vaccinated. Therefore, they're blocking access to this medication. But I do want to point out a simple fact that treatment is not the same as prevention. We call that prophylaxis. Treatment is not the same as prevention. Vaccine is not a treatment, it's a preventative measure. So if you want to compare vaccine, you have to compare with something equivalent. So you have to look at the preventative effect of these drugs. So I'm going to pick ivermectin as an example because that's the one that's getting most amount of attention. So again, if you want to go to the public library, type in PubMed, ivermectin and COVID-19. What do you get? When I did it a couple of days ago, I got 258 search. That's not a lot, because we're talking about thousands of articles with COVID-19. If you narrow those articles down to clinical trials, you get 12 hits. In other words, despite all the hypes about ivermectin, there are actually only very few studies looking at ivermectin. There's a group called Cochrane Review where they looked at ivermectin and looked at all the literature, trying to work out whether is it effective or not. And they're an unbiased group. And they found 14 studies with 1,678 participants and looked at the studies and read through all of them and decided there's a varying qualities in this, and they found that it wasn't conclusive. Compare that to Pfizer vaccine study, which looked at 43,000 participants. 14 little studies compared to one big study, the data are completely different. Out of that, one study looked at ivermectin to prevent COVID-19. I think now there might be 2 or 3. But really, they're not blockbuster studies. They're very small numbers. The studies don't always show positive findings. So overall conclusion is, based on the current very low to low risk certain evidence, we are uncertain about the efficacy and safety of ivermectin used to treat or prevent COVID-19. What does that mean? It means we're not sure if it's going to work. And that's after looking at all those studies that's published objectively. So here's a question. Yes, you might say there's a controversy around ivermectin, people are hiding it, but there is no data to really suggest that it's really working. So, whereas a vaccine study has shown clear benefits in reducing COVID-19. So if you have to choose between a treatment that's shown clear benefits versus a treatment that really didn't show much benefits, which is a better one to choose? And you also have to remember, when you look at ivermectin studies, most of them are performed in resource-poor settings, and the study is not conducted in the most robust way. The data for vaccine is far better than ivermectin. And I just picked ivermectin as an example. But you can do the same thing for hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and other things. Some people say, I'll wait for herd immunity. Well, what is herd immunity? So if you can see it in the picture, you have the blue people, which represents people who are not immunized but still healthy. And then yellow people are people who are immunized and healthy, and red is the one who got sick. and therefore is passing on the infection. So in a population, if you have a few people who are infected, then as represented by red, what happens is then they pass the infection to the next healthy person who gets sick, and then it passes on and so forth, and before long the whole population can get infected. And that's essentially what's happening in COVID-19. Now, if you have a few people who are immunized or who got sick and recovered and therefore immune, then you can see that it still spreads through a number of healthy people who are not immune. But if you have enough people who are either immunized or recovered from infection, therefore has immunity against infection, then even though there are a few people who are infected, the chance of the virus passing through is much lower because it just doesn't have enough people to pass on to the next person. And that's essentially the concept behind herd immunity, that if enough people have immunity against virus, then the people who are not immune can still be protected as a group. So herd immunity relies on enough people having immunity to COVID-19, and that's a key concept. Now, a very simple fact, COVID-19 is not going to go away. I think we can agree on that. It's not going to go away anytime soon. So, what are the possibilities? Well, we've been implementing elimination strategies, and that's why we've been getting frequent lockdowns to prevent infection spreading. But if it's not going to go away, and we still have COVID-19 going around in community, abroad, or in Australia as we're doing right now, how are we going to get out of the lockdown? It's a real problem. And eventually, to really come out of lockdown, we really have to achieve herd immunity in some meaningful way. And that means one of the three things. Either one, enough people need to get vaccinated. Two, enough people need to be infected and survive. And or the combination of the above. So logically, if not enough people are going to be vaccinated, then there's only one alternative. Or you can say two alternatives. One, we continue to go into lockdown out, or you're going to get an infection and you achieve it that way. What about the argument, I have right to refuse the vaccine? Yes, you have right to say no. But of course, this doesn't mean you shouldn't get vaccination. Because I think we model up the concept of rights and responsibility. I've always thought that as a Christian, we have to think of responsibility before we come up with rights. But I'm hearing these days an awful lot of rights to freedom to choose. I have a freedom to say no. And that is true. But we have to also remember that responsibility comes with freedom to choose. What about the argument the vaccine comes from aborted fetus? Now, it's true that AstraZeneca vaccines were developed using human cell lines developed from aborted fetus. This was decades ago. That doesn't mean that same fetal cell is still used, but it's a cell line, which means they have an original fetal cell which has undergone multiple divisions, thousands of divisions. So therefore, there are actually no fetal cells in the vaccine. Now, I'm not going to go into this because other people have covered this in much bigger detail, and I'll put a reference there. You can have a look at the position statement on immunization. We also have a podcast link which goes into this in greater details. Finally, I think this is where a lot of people are at. I am really confused. Who do I listen to? It's not really your fault because there are too many experts giving too many different opinions. And my opinion might be one of them. And you have to remember that some of these people have excellent credentials. They were scientists with decades of experience, they're professors, someone with far more credential than what I have. And of course, I have to admit that some of these talks are far more interesting and colorful than the boring talk I'm giving you. But I would like you to ask and pray and ask for discernment. And I would like you to do your homework. And I would actually suggest reading boring materials because, when you're in school, comics are really more interesting than textbook. But if you want to do well, you're probably better off reading textbook. For making important life decisions, I would suggest sometimes the boring stuff are more useful. And for those of you who are rather confused and not sure which way to turn to, I would ask you to doubt your doubt. Many of us are in lockdown and we are heavily exposed to a lot of both valid and invalid information related to COVID-19 in social media. I would like you to please be careful not to be fed with false information out there because there are many, many misleading claims that gives you unnecessary fear, cynicism, and uncertainty. It is important that you access correct information and have those information correctly interpreted. Therefore, I suggest you talk to your local doctor about that. And you can also visit the website as shown in the slide here. Finally, should Christians get vaccinated? Let's put things in perspective and you can answer this question. First of all, our salvation comes from Jesus. So therefore, getting vaccine does not forfeit your salvation. Whether you get vaccine or not, that's not going to influence your salvation. It's not a mark of beast. It is not a decision of faith or lack of faith for that matter. I would like to argue that medicine is a gift from God. And if medicine is a gift from God, could COVID-19 vaccines actually be a gift from God as well? Could COVID-19 vaccines be answered to prayers? I believe it is. I would like you to consider science and look at the data and see that COVID-19 vaccine is effective and safe. It doesn't mean it's got no risk, but it is safe. And it is clearly more beneficial than getting the infection itself. So with all that, the last question is, what is a loving thing to do? And these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But greatest of these is love. If you'd like to know more, I have put up the further resources on the next page, and please visit these websites. And if you want to see what I'm saying is true, I have also put in all the references so that you can check it out for yourself. Thank you and God bless.